Well, hello and welcome to Chapter 8. You thought you would avoid my voice today, but unfortunately, I'm afraid I'm going to talk to you anyway. I want to introduce Chapter 8 and the supply curve, and because I couldn't be here, being up with the students on Capitol Hill today, I thought this was the best way to introduce this chapter to you without being there. So we're going to look at the supply curve. We'll look at what goes into the supply curve, and we'll also those inputs. We'll also look at what is created as a result, the outputs, and how that contributes to what we call diminishing returns. We've talked about a lot of diminishing marginal utility. In this case, we're looking at diminishing returns based on those inputs. We'll also look at cost curves, the idea of how cost curves come to be and what are the differences in those cost curves. We'll also start to talk about this idea of short run versus long run and how that impacts economies of scale, how we gain efficiencies and what those mean. So let's launch right into it. Let's talk about the production function. We've been talking about the utility function in the last unit. Today we're going to talk about the idea of production, what it means for a business or for a corporation to basically produce something. That could be a good, it could be a service. There are different ways that obviously things are produced, and they're based on inputs, fixed inputs, those things that cannot be varied. We think of a fixed cost like a mortgage or something that we're having to pay, and then a variable input, something that varies along the way. The quantity of that and of that input can vary in terms of, well, maybe it's a worker that gains additional resources, and the pay varies according to time. That could be a variable input that we see here. In the long run, the idea is everything can vary. All of the costs that we have can vary in the long run, but in the short run, some of them are fixed. The idea that we can spread out those issues over time. Think about it in terms of your business, the one you created in the activity we did in Chapter 7. That business has some fixed costs. You enter into a long-term lease. You buy a mortgage, and you're paying on that mortgage. Those are fixed costs in the short run because there are certain payments you have to make and timelines you have to abide by because you've signed a contract to abide by those and to pay those. But longer term, if it's not working out at that location, you could sell the property. If you're in a lease that's 2 years or 5-year lease, you could ultimately break that lease. And so in the short run, you're stuck with it. But in the long run, the idea there is that all of those inputs can be variable because you can always sell the property. You can always break the lease or move when the lease is up. So that's where the idea is that in the long run, everything is variable. And the total product curve essentially is going to show us how that output in terms of what we're producing, based on the quantity that we're trying to produce and the variable inputs that are in there, essentially are put together with the fixed inputs, and that essentially gives us our total product curve. What is being produced? What is the total product of what we're putting into it and what we're getting out of it? So that's essentially the total product curve, and we see that as an upward sloping curve. We've talked about that in terms of like a supply curve. This essentially would be that supply curve, and it's a production function. The idea is that what is being produced based on how much labor we have and how much wheat that we have, we're getting a marginal product of labor, looking at how much labor is going into it and what we're producing as a result of it. So this is upward sloping. We hope that by adding additional workers to help with gathering the wheat is the example Krugman is using here, that we can produce more. And that's not always going to be the case. As you can see, there's a diminishing marginal product of labor. As we produce more, we're hoping to produce more in terms of total product, but that marginal product is diminishing over time. Just because we're adding additional workers doesn't necessarily mean that we're always adding product, and the total product continues to rise at the same pace. And that's what's key. At the same pace, no, they're not. They're not adding to the total product at the same pace, because as you can see, as you add more employees, it gets trickier in terms of more people you have to train, more things that can go wrong, more issues that people will have along the way, and that contributes to a diminishing marginal product of labor. And that so while this is upward sloping, the idea is, just as we talked about with total utility, eventually you do reach a point at which you're still increasing, but you're doing it at a smaller and smaller pace as a result. So the marginal product of labor essentially is this change in the quantity of the output divided by the change in the quantity of the labor. Just as we talked about in this last slide with the quantity of labor and with the quantity of wheat, we can essentially use those to establish our marginal product of labor, this change in quantity of output over the change in the quantity of labor. And what that's going to do is show us how much we can produce by adding one more additional input to create an additional output, and how that then contributes to our total product. So as we've already established, the idea is there are diminishing returns here. As we produce more, we're still going to have more total product that's being produced, but the amount of that total product continues to diminish over time. And going back to the slide, we can see that it's upward sloping, it's increasing, but doing it at a slower pace. 19, then to 17. We're getting down to 11, 9, 7, 5. So it's starting to diminish in terms of the pace of that return based on each input that's being added, which makes sense. As you add an additional worker, you're not always going to get the same level of product out of those workers, because additional factors, communication and level of output, how they work together, if it's an assembly line, that makes a difference. So the marginal product of labor curve, as you can imagine, is downward sloping because adding that additional worker is going to increase the output, but again, it's going to do it at a diminishing pace over time. So if we put the two together here, as we'll see, total product upward sloping and marginal product downward sloping. But as you can see here in the example of George and Martha's farms, we can shift that curve. In terms of George and Martha's farm, we can shift that curve if we have more land. By adding an input, we can shift that curve upward. But just adding more land isn't necessarily going to contribute to a substantial or an exponential increase in total product. So buying land will help to shift the curve, as we see in this case. It's moving the total product curve upward. And contributing to more product being produced as a result of adding the land. But it's also going to shift the marginal product curve upward, but it's still diminishing. So the idea there is even though the total product curve is increasing because of the new land that's being purchased and added to an input, it's adding to total product curve, but it's also shifted the marginal product curve in terms of it's at a higher marginal product of labor, but it is still diminishing over time, and that also goes to show that the input of adding land and buying more land doesn't necessarily increase the productivity of each worker who's working the land. There's still got to be other efficiencies and things to take into account in order to keep total product curve rising. So looking at the cost curves then, let's talk about a couple of those. So we want to look at what fixed costs are. And again, the idea is this is a cost regardless of the quantity that's being produced. So the cost of the fixed input is what we call a fixed cost. It's something that is going to be fixed in the short run, and that's the lease or the purchase of property that I mentioned. Even if you want to sell it, it takes time to do that. So you're kind of stuck in the short term because you can't necessarily just dump it. But in the variable cost, and what we know is all costs eventually become variable cost in the long run because I can get out of that lease. I can sell that property. I can move on to something else, and that's the flexibility that we have in variable variable costs. So we get the total cost then by adding both of these up. The fixed costs and the variable costs, we put them together to get what we call our total cost curve, which is what we saw there as an upward sloping curve. It does become steeper as output is produced, as additional inputs are added, but again, this is due to diminishing returns. So it is growing, it is increasing, but it's doing it at a slower pace each time additional inputs are added. And that's what we see here in terms of the curve. It is upward sloping in that nature, but the idea is that it is still going to continue to rise, but it's going to do it at a slower pace. Things are going to slow down as you added those additional workers. Now, why is marginal cost curve upward sloping? Because as you can imagine, as you add additional workers, your costs are going to continue to rise. And just because you're taking advantage of efficiencies doesn't mean that you're always going to be able to do it under the same roof. Marginal costs, as you add additional workers, as you add additional product, you're going to see it's going to contribute to additional costs as a result of that. And so that's why this marginal cost curve is also upward sloping. We get the average cost then, and these are pretty self-explanatory, but average total cost would be looking at your total cost divided by the quantity of your output that you're producing. That would give you your average total cost, or ATC. We'll refer to it as ATC quite a bit. We have the average fixed cost, or the AFC, which is looking at your fixed costs, dividing that by the quantity of the output. And then variable costs, the average variable cost, or the AVC, would be variable costs divided by the quantity of your output produced. That's going to give you the AVC. So all of those terms we use quite frequently. Let's talk about what we see there in the ATC. We have a couple of things happening with the ATC. Notice we have fixed costs and variable costs here. So with fixed costs, we're going to get what's called the spreading effect, which means if I'm paying a mortgage or I'm paying a rent on a lease, I'm going to be able to spread that out over time. That's called the spreading effect. So I'm going to share that cost over a period of 2 years, 5 years. That's 2 years, a 2-year lease. That's 24 payments. A 5-year lease, that's 60 payments. So I'm spreading out that payment. I don't have to pay it all at once. I'm paying it over time, and that's spreading out that that pain, if you will, of paying the mortgage or paying that lease. So it doesn't have as much impact on this month's total cost. So average total cost, again, takes advantage of that spreading effect. And then we also have diminishing returns effect, which is this idea that as we add inputs and we produce additional units, it is going to be diminishing in terms of we're still going to be increasing, but doing it at a slower pace in terms of the effect of the output as we add that input to those. And so that's where we start to see the idea of this kind of swoosh, the Nike swoosh, because we're downward sloping in terms of taking advantage of some marginal costs that we're able to take advantage of and experience what we call economies of scale, which we'll talk about in a minute. But this idea here is that these costs are falling, and we're able to take advantage of that spreading effect. But over time, that diminishes in nature, and then we start to see other things that are going to impact this and lead to a rise in those average total costs. So we're able to use that spreading effect to help with economies of scale in the short run. But as we see longer term, the ATC is going to rise because we're going to have diminishing returns kicking in, and at higher levels, that's going to be more challenging to keep those costs down. So a couple of things in terms of putting these cost curves together that we should also address here, and some rules to keep in mind. First of all, marginal cost is upward sloping. In nature, as we add inputs, we're going to be adding to those marginal costs, the cost of producing one more. Average variable cost is upward sloping. In terms of, again, as we add more input and try and produce more, we're going to add to those variable costs. The average fixed cost, or the AFC, is downward sloping, and that's because of the spreading effect. As we add to, as we contribute to that 60-month lease, we're going to spread that out over time. And maybe you stay in the building longer, you own it, you had 60 payments, and now you don't have any. So that's going to contribute to a spreading effect that gets very close to the the horizontal axis because of the spreading effect, but never quite reaches it. And that continues to benefit business as long as they can utilize those resources. And then the last one, essentially dealing with marginal cost, that upward sloping curve, it does intersect the cost curve at its lowest point. Okay, so it's going to, and this is key, because when we graph these, you're going to notice that the marginal cost curve needs to intersect ATC and AVC at their lowest points. And that's because as those marginal costs start to rise, we're no longer experiencing those economies of scale with ATC or AVC. And as a result, we're going to see an increase in those costs. And that's going to be determined by wherever the marginal cost curve intersects those curves. So, and it'll make more sense when we get to the graph here, as we see. So marginal cost curve continues to be upward sloping. We see ATC can take advantage of costs in the short run, but longer term we're going to experience rising ATC costs. AVC is always rising, and then AFC, the fixed costs due to the spreading effect, continue to diminish over time, and we'll get closer to the horizontal axis as a result. So it kind of creates this idea of the spreading effect, and you can see it really playing out here in terms of the getting lower and lower and lower in terms of AFC, the average fixed cost, as a result of that. Now, as it says here, the bottom of the U-curve is at the level of output at which the marginal cost curve crosses the ATC from below. Is this an accident? It is not. And in this case, what we see here is that ATC is intersected by the marginal cost curve at its lowest point. And so that's really important to note. And so it's not an accident, because the idea here is as costs continue to rise, you're able short term to take advantage of some of those economies of scale, but even those start to work against you and start to chip away at your costs, and they'll start to rise over time. And that, because of these average variable costs that are upward sloping, we will see the ATC will take a turn at that marginal cost curve and also continue to be upward sloping as a result. Now, some principles to keep in mind for these average total cost curves and the marginal cost curve is that at the minimum cost output, ATC should equal MC. And that is true if we look here. At the minimal cost, the ATC is intersecting at M here with the marginal cost curve. That is critical, and that is a common principle to keep in mind. At the minimum cost output, where we've taken advantage of the economies of scale, our ATC should equal our marginal cost, and that's why marginal cost is intersecting ATC at its lowest point. At the output less than the minimum cost output, we're going to see marginal cost is less than ATC. And your ATC is falling. Again, taking advantage of the economies of scale that we see going on here in this particular space. We see the economies of scale kicking in. ATC is falling as a result, even though marginal cost is continuing to rise. And then lastly, at an output greater than marginal minimum cost output, the marginal cost is going to be greater than ATC. And ATC is going to be rising. So we see that here in terms of the marginal cost then intersects ATC and continues to rise, even though it's rising at a faster pace. We're still taking advantage of spreading effect kicking in here, so it's going to mute the effects of the AVC curve because of the spreading effect, and that causes it to continue to rise, but doing it at a slower pace, and we'll see ATC and AVC get closer and closer together as a result of that cost curve rising. So what we see here is there's a relationship between marginal cost and average total cost, in that they are rising. ATC again will do it at a slower pace because of the spreading effect over the average fixed costs, but the idea here is we must be at the intersection point if we're getting close. If we see marginal cost rising and ATC falling, that means sooner or later we're going to see an intersection of those two, and marginal cost will continue to rise. Average total cost will then stop experiencing economies of scale and also will rise along with the marginal cost curve. So it's upward. What's the deal there? Well, you may recall that's because of the swoosh that we see in the red marginal cost curve here. The swoosh is essentially taking advantage of those economies of scale on the initial end as we experiencing economies of scale. So a lot of times the marginal cost curve is downward sloping before it's upward sloping, and the idea there is because as you start to ramp up and you add additional workers, you have the opportunity to take advantage of efficiencies. And by having specialization of labor, by having people learning jobs and tasks they can get really good at, you can experience economies of scale and essentially be more efficient with the resources that you're producing. But that's only going to last so long. And the idea there is diminishing returns would eventually set in. So while you have that opportunity in the short run there, the marginal cost curve being that downward sloping, eventually it's going to reach a point at which you can only go so low in terms of your costs, and then those costs will start to rise. And that's essentially why we see a downward sloping marginal cost curve before we see an upward sloping marginal cost curve. And again, we see that with AVC here. It's intersected by marginal cost curve at its lowest point. We see ATC, the same is true. Again, they're taking advantage of these economies of scale, sometimes a little longer than marginal cost curve, because again, as marginal costs, the cost of it producing an additional unit starts to rise, you're still taking advantage of the spreading effect, which isn't necessarily, which is kind of negating those costs and leading to that downward sloping curve, but it only lasts so long. Eventually, you're going to see that average total cost and average variable cost start to rise as diminishing returns start to set in and increase at a greater effect as a result of that. So this leads to key graph 29. Get out your graphing notebook. I'll let you pause here and conduct the graph, and then I'll talk about it. So essentially, key graph 29 is just addressing what we've talked about, the idea of the swoosh with the marginal cost curve. It is taking advantage of economies of scale and then starts to kick in. Those diminishing returns will be kicking in, leading to an upward sloping marginal cost curve. Average total cost, kind of the U-shape effect that we see here because of economies of scale and the spreading effect, but eventually diminishing returns set in. MC intersects ATC at its lowest point. Make sure when you draw the graph, the marginal cost curve is intersecting ATC at its lowest point. That will be an incorrect graph if it isn't. It's also intersecting AVC at its lowest point. And that is because, again, as we take advantage of economies of scale, adding workers, we are experiencing great efficiencies as a result of that, but that only lasts for so long, and then it becomes upward sloping. Increasing costs start to rise, AVC rises, and ATC will get closer and closer to AVC as both of them start to rise. So that's key graph 29. And again, if you have questions, please post them to Emoto or email me or talk to me next week, and we're happy to address those particular questions. Now I'm going to ask that you take what Ms. Donahoe gave you in Activity 3-3 and work on some of those problems. I'm not going to address all of those here. We'll do that when I come back, but this is a good activity for you to take a look at. I'm not going to go into it in great detail here, but you can pause this and take some time to take a look at that. I've got some additional thoughts on short run versus long run I want to address, and so you can come back to this when you're done with 3-3, or you can continue to plow through. Totally depends on you. But let's talk short run. Short run versus long run, essentially, we've addressed that already, but I just want to reiterate, this is when fixed costs become variable in the long run. Those fixed costs in the short run, the lease I can't get out of in the short term, I can get out of in the long term. And so as those fixed costs spread over time, I can sell the property. It may take me a year or two to do it, but I can sell the property if I need to. Those fixed costs become variable. And in the long run, all of those fixed costs that we're addressing here would become variable in terms of the output that they're expected to produce. So the example that the Krugman text gives here is DC versus Chicago in terms of snow removal. This would have an effect if DC experienced more snow than usual. They would have a fixed cost that is going to hit them pretty hard in the short run, but they can get better equipment in the long run. They can They can change the budget in order to address better snow removal equipment and have more of an impact. So fixed costs can impact them in the short run much greater, but in the long run, they can take a bigger effect on that by being able to do more things with it, change around the budget in order to provide more snow removal equipment and machinery and that sort of thing to try and address it. And that's really where it does make a huge difference in terms of those fixed costs no longer being fixed. They are more variable. And we see that playing out here with the average total cost. Notice there's a lower fixed cost. You're taking advantage of economies of scale, but eventually those costs are going to intersect with MC, and those fixed costs will start to rise in terms of the fixed costs at stake here. Now notice that when you're producing at lower levels, you're able to take advantage of a lot of those economies of scale, and you experience a falling ATC. And you would do that with higher fixed costs and with lower fixed costs because you're not producing a whole lot. But as you produce more and as you add more workers and as you produce more product and it gets exponentially larger, you're going to experience those average costs starting to rise, those average total costs particularly starting to rise. And so that's where you see the ATC at these higher output levels, you see those costs really start to ramp up. You had lower fixed costs before, and you were able to take advantage of that, but that's only going to last for so long, and then that really kicks into higher costs in the longer term because those efficiencies just aren't efficient anymore. With all of the number of people that you've added, the additional plant that you've brought online or whatever, you're producing more, but your costs are definitely rising as a result of it. And even with high fixed costs, you experience the spreading effect that in that economy of scale in the short term. But as you continue to produce more, you're going to see that high fixed cost is going to lead to a leveling off of ATC, and eventually you'll start to see that turn around and start to rise as well. Because the idea there is as you're producing more, as the output essentially is rising, your ATC may be lower with some of those fixed costs and the spreading effect of those fixed costs. But in the long run, it's going to contribute to a greater total cost as a result. So how does that affect LRATC, what we call the long run average total cost curve? This is the relationship between the output and the ATC. When you have fixed cost that you're trying to minimize ATC at different levels. So that's probably all Greek, but essentially the easiest way to explain it is to show it. And that's by looking at these little short run ATC curves that we have been talking about back here. These are all kind of short run ATC curves, but what we see is over time it creates a trend. And in the short term, we try and continue to be on this side, this idea of economies of scale, where we're more efficient with our resources. But what we do experience over time is that we find with those average total costs rising and inefficiencies being created as more workers are being added, we will start to see that falling and reaching a point at which we call the constant returns to scale, which is this point, the lowest point of this LRATC curve. And then eventually those costs will start to rise. The average total cost starts to rise in the long run. And the key for a business is to try and stay on this side of that LRATC curve by continuing to find ways to experience new short-run ATCs, new short-run average total costs, and new efficiencies in various costs that you have. So the idea is that this LRATC is made up of these smaller short-run ATC curves that hopefully are continuing to try and find ways to take advantage of economies of scale. But as you can see in this SRATC, they're not doing so. It's not contributing. And businesses experience this all the time. McDonald's is a great example. They try something new and it doesn't work. And that's a part of diseconomies of scale. And it's contributing to their increasing LRATC as a result. So just because they try something doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work, and it certainly doesn't mean that it's going to be efficient. So what we see here is the long run ATC, this bigger curve, has economies of scale on the left side, a constant return to scale at point C, and then increasing costs and diseconomies of scale on the right-hand side in terms of that LRATC. And the key is you don't want to be there. That's when CEOs lose their jobs. That's when shareholders lose market value for their products, and the business can either experience layoffs, reductions in force, plants closing, and all kinds of problems that could eventually lead to the businesses closing its doors. So economies of scale, the idea here is average total cost is declining as your output increases. We hope we're taking advantage of that in terms of efficiencies that keep those ATC costs, those average total costs falling. But diseconomies of scale is where we essentially hit that constant return to scale, where LRATC is meeting output as it increases. And then we launch into diseconomies of scale, essentially when that long run ATC is going to start increasing as you increase the output. And once again, here are a couple of activities for you to do as a result of this as we close out the chapter. Hope you found this helpful. Take it back to, take this video and back and watch it again if needed at 2 times the speed. That is speed up Mr. Rodman. But I hope you found this helpful, and please definitely save your questions for Monday. We'll talk more about it and do an activity related to this. And then you're always welcome to email me or to post those questions on Emoto for the class to be able to see as well. Have a great day. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.